Very interesting. All right, thank you, Mr. McGee. Let's next hear from Mindy Romero from the California Civic Engagement Project at UC Davis's Center for Regional Change.
I will be my own tech person here for the moment. There we go. Oh, maybe not. Sure. Well, I'll start by saying thank you all very much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to present before the committees. My name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the California Civic Engagement Project at UC Davis Center for Regional Change. And I'm here to talk to you about the youth vote. And we've already had quite a discussion about the youth vote today. So hopefully we'll be able to expand that. So the research, I'm going to present to you highlights of recent research. This is the policy brief that we released in January, and it's available on our website. But of course, all of you have it in your packets today. Very briefly, study methodology as I talk about voter turnout and voter data. That is data, actual voter records from the California Secretary of State and its 58 county election offices. And when I talk about population data, that's coming from the California Department of Finance, both population and citizen voting age population data. So we've talked a lot about that record low turnout, that eligible turnout of only 31% last November. There was quite a question, though, in terms of what did that low turnout mean for underrepresented groups, groups that historically don't turn out in high numbers or turn out in lower numbers than other groups. Youth are very much a part of that. So youth historically turn out in much lower numbers than other age groups, older age groups. And when there is a low turnout, the disparity between youth and older groups is greater. The question was how low was youth turnout given the fact that we reached a record? So my answer to this question was already given earlier. So what was youth eligible voter turnout in the November 2014 general election? So in the report, it's 8.2%. So meaning, just to make it clear, that over 90% of our eligible youth, and we define eligible as citizen, over 18, and youth would be age 18 to 24 citizen, voted in November's election. And just to visualize that really briefly here, on the far left is at 8.2% for 18 to 24-year-olds. On the far right is at 30.9% for the total electorate. And you can see that turnout is quite low as you go up in age or age group. But for 65 to 74-year-olds and 75 plus, turnout doesn't look as bad, right? Still arguably low. We want to see it high for everyone. But those are the age groups that turn out, are very likely to turn out right frequently in every election. So this means that of our 3.5 million eligible youth that voted in, eligible youth that are present, that reside in California.
Youth means
age 18 to 24.
24. Okay.
Is how we're defining it. Yeah, thank you. Only 285,000 of those 3.5 million actually voted last November. So you could say essentially the youth vote was nearly non-existent last November. So they're underrepresented, of course, among voters. They're 14.5% of that eligible voter population. So those that are age 18 citizens, 18 and above and citizens, meaning that they were only 3.9% though of all voters. 8.2% turnout made 3.9% of all voters for youth. So they're underrepresented because they have lower turnout rates, but also because, as Eric just mentioned as well, registration is a major factor. So we have a two-step voting process in our state and in our nation. You must first register before you can vote. And youth are disproportionately disadvantaged in the registration process. So quickly, and we again discuss all of this more in depth in the report, but our 18 to 24-year-olds last November, and about now still, only 52% of those eligible citizens actually were registered. And interestingly enough, every other age group, even the next cohort, 25 to 34-year-olds, are above 70%. So a huge gap when we're looking at our youth in terms of their registration rates. Registration by party. So you may have all heard, of course, that for a little while, there's been a discussion about increasing NPP registrants in California, right? So now 23% of all registrants in the state of California, according to the Secretary of State, are NPP, or the old declined estate. But for youth, quite different. So youth are, again, age 18 to 24, are the only age group below 40% Democratic, registering Democratic, the only age group below 20% Republican, and they are nearly the same in proportions NPP as they are Democratic. They're about 36% Democratic. And in just 2 years since 2012, their numbers or their proportions that are NPP have increased about 7%. So what is their impact on the electoral landscape? Well, one I just showed you, which is driving youth or driving the change in party affiliation. They're 1 in 4 of all registrants in California. But also demographic population shifts, and that's an important part of the discussion. So we're an aging society, right? California is aging a little bit less than the rest of their slower rate than the rest of the nation, but we are. Not a whole lot of discussion, though, about what does this mean for the political voice or the civic voice of youth. We talk a lot about older folks, but what about the voice of youth? So their proportions of the overall population will be declining over the next 30 years or so, but so will their proportions of the eligible voter population in California. Let me visualize that here for you. If you just focus on the far left, age 18 to 24, again, this is in your report. Every color represents an election year. 2014, 2016 is red, 2020 is green. You can see that 14.5% in 2014, that they are 14.5% of the eligible voter population, or as we define it up there, citizen voting age. And subsequently, 2016, 2020, they decline until about 22, and they start to increase again in their proportions of the eligible voter population. And interestingly enough, between now and 2020, they're actually declining in their absolute numbers as well in the state.
And how did you model that for 2040? I mean, what?
Sure. We worked with the California Department of Finance does projections periodically on the population in California.
So this is just reflective of the aging population?
Yes. So birth rates, fertility rates, current immigration law, and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So we also were able to project out the youth vote using these projections in the eligible voter population for youth. And I will show you just one way that we discuss this is assuming turnout rates for youth stay constant. They won't stay exactly constant, of course, but if we want to isolate the impact of population decline for youth, and we hold their turnout rates constant, and here, for this analysis, we looked at presidential years going forward, because our next election is a presidential year. So we hold their eligible turnout rate, which in 2020 was about 30%. And you look over the next 30 years or so, the blue line is youth. The red line for comparison are those age over 64, so again, the group that has the highest turnout rate, and their turnout rate in 2012 was 73%. Youth, again, was 30%. If we keep both rates constant over the next 30 years, we can see the impact of population change. So youth were 8.1% of all voters in 2012 because they had a higher turnout rate. They declined by 2032, and you can see older voters increasing quite dramatically. And the gap between the proportions of the vote, California's vote, between these two groups are growing. Okay. So this means that there will be challenges, right, to the strength of the electoral and civic voice of youth in California. Arguably, there are already a lot of challenges. They're already underrepresented in those discussions and at the table. As their population decreases, or the proportions of population and the proportions of the voter population decrease, it's going to be more difficult. And when we talk about policy, and folks such as yourselves are making very important policy decisions in California, you look to your constituents, you look for very important input, and to identify need, right? And if there's a smaller voice or a voice that is not as loud among our youth, that could potentially bring challenges. Okay, what can be done to improve turnout? Well, first off, why does it even matter? I hear from a lot of folks that aren't necessarily, some are very concerned, but some are not necessarily that concerned about youth turnout because they will say, well, they'll figure it out when they get older. Right? Or maybe it's not such a bad idea that if younger folks are not voting because they don't have a stake in the game or they're not educated or whatever it might be. But the fact of the matter is the data tell us that they don't vote later. Only some of our non-voting youth, most of our youth don't vote, and only some come into the electorate as they age. And as Eric pointed out, it creates a very skewed electorate. So we have an electorate that doesn't represent its citizens because we only have a proportion, right, a very specific element of our population as it ages that comes into the electorate. So there are youth voice matters. There are a whole heck, even with population decline, there's a whole heck of a lot of eligible youth in California and more that could be eligible that don't have a voice. But youth voting benefits more than just youth. If you are concerned about record low turnout or the prospect of more years with low turnout, you need to be concerned about the youth vote because voting is habit forming. Research tells us that if we get 18-year-olds to vote, they are much more likely to continue to vote through the life course. If we don't get them, then again, we only get some later. And if we get them when they're 18, then in pretty short fashion, we create a generation of voters, you're going to end up getting older cohorts that vote in higher numbers as well. Okay? Recent efforts, just really briefly, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. AB 700, which regenerated itself through other bills as well, which I can talk about. AB 1817, civics education in schools. So here, this is the efforts across different school districts and different schools. We have Civitas, a program for civics education right here in our backyard in Sacramento at Rio Americano High. We have programs like Generation Citizen over in the Bay Area. We have individual programs that do a lot of great work, but they are individual programs. At our school sites. Recent reforms such as OVR and same-day registration, I'll leave that there, but if you're interested in the impact of youth, I'm happy to talk about impact on the youth vote. I'm happy to talk about that. But what can be done? So what are things that we still should be and could be looking at? So the structure of our electoral system, the registration requirements, as has already been discussed, are very restrictive for our youth, for all age groups. But youth are disproportionately impacted. They're less familiar with the registration process, with the voting process, period. And we see that in their registration numbers. Outreach is absolutely critical, and youth get very little outreach. They get very little instruction, right, in their civics education in schools. They get very little instruction, even from we have wonderful registrar's offices here present, but across the state, there aren't the resources, right, for our governmental entities to be able to reach out and teach and mobilize youth into the electoral process. Those that are responsible for it are campaigns and candidates, and we know that they use the likely voter model, so we get very few youth, as they are seen to be not necessarily good investments, very few youth that are mobilized in that process. Civics education in schools, something we could talk about would be the Power of Democracy initiative, and it's now 6-county pilot program, taking advantage, looking at this as a very opportune time in California with the recent reforms around Common Core and local accountability plans, seeking to, as those reforms are implemented, to prioritize civics in those discussions and in those restructuring. And then new approaches, because if we really want to move the needle in California on voter turnout, particularly for our youth, in any significant way, we have to do something else. We have to talk beyond just these common solutions. And that's it. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. All three. So let me actually start with you, Mindy. I'm
Sure.
interested in a number of things you brought up. And let me refer to several things that have been discussed earlier in today's discussion. So first of all, do you think, it sounds, there is this extraordinary disadvantage for the very youngest of our voters because there's just a, higher likelihood that they will not have, they've lived less time as an eligible voter, so they're just less likely to have been registered at some point. So if we did automatically register voters here, do you think that would have a significant impact on turnout?
I think well, if I paraphrase what Eric said a moment ago, outreach is absolutely critical. So there is research and data to suggest that automatic registration would impact youth as a group that has lower turnout. But what's even more critical is that educational component, really bringing youth into the electorate, showing them why it's important, why it's relevant to their lives, why they should care, why it impacts their communities, because youth do care a lot. And we have lots of survey data and research to show that youth are very involved and care very much. They're not apathetic, but they're disconnected. That caring and that work that they do in their local communities isn't transitioning into the electoral process, and they don't see the connection. So you can register them automatically, and I think that's absolute. I think that would be something that would be positive for youth. The data suggests to us, but we would need to do so much more. It's not going to fix the problem, and particularly for youth, you need to connect it with an education and understanding about what that means. Otherwise, you set them up to fail. To say you're registered, why aren't you voting?
But why is it that people seem to find the relevance of voting over time? Like what's it about living in this world that makes you more want to vote? I mean, in many
Sure.
ways, one could suggest that it can make you more cynical. It can make you, could turn you off to the process, especially given all the mistrust and scandals and problems that have existed. Is it this voter turnout mechanism that the campaigns do that ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy?
There is a vicious cycle, certainly, with the likely voter model. I will say that part of the reason why we're looking at low turnout, period, across the electorate is that more and more folks are reporting, of any age group, of whatever age we're talking about, a disconnection, and if you want to translate it into a cynicism, but a disconnection from the political process and not seeing how elected officials and the electoral process is relevant and matters to their life, and why their vote matters, and that's absolutely key. So that really is an across-the-board kind of thing. But why it still does increase, or why people vote more when they get older? Lots of factors. So some of which I think Eric already connected on, but. As you get more of a stake in the game, as you get older, you have, first off, more information, more experience, more access to information. Information for voting is absolutely key, and young people are information poor. So you get more information about the electoral process. You have more experience with it. You may own a home. You may feel more rooted. You have children, more rooted in your community. And there are other factors with youth that also disadvantage them, which I could get into, but youth being highly mobile as well. And yeah, and you are targeted as you get older because of historical tendencies. Youth are not seen as a viable investment, whereas older voters are seen as somebody that do vote, or at least can be transitioned into voting if it's a competitive election and every vote is being attempted to be got.
Did you see any, and the other panelists can answer this as well, but obviously the 2008 election in particular, but also 2012 to a lesser extent, was kind of universally recognized as an extraordinary moment of youth outreach and turnout, both because of the presidential elections, but also, 2012 Prop 30, for example, was a great success. Did you find that other campaigns were looking at that, anticipating it, and engaging with youth as well because they knew they'd be turning out for the presidential or Prop 30? And so there was engagement across the board, or did the kind of traditional political powers that be not engage youth and just kind of let the presidential campaigns and Prop 30 reach out to them?
And when you say traditional, do you mean?
Let's say like a down ballot race. Did you I don't know. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, did you see anything, is there anything special from the 2008 and 2012 experiences here in California that we can glean information from? Because those were examples of really rather special turnout and maybe success stories that we can learn more from.
Well, so you asked, those are all great questions. They're really, there would be a lot of detail in there, but I can probably address it a little more broadly. First off, in 2008, what folks talked about is the Obama bump, and you had a lot of press around the strength of the youth vote, right, coming out of the 2008 election. Actually, there was a growth in the youth vote nationally during the 2000s that started about 2002, 2004. So first off, the increase that we saw, or what looked like a big increase in 2008, wasn't as big as people talked about or thought that it was, just to put that on the table. But what happened in 2008 more than anything is you had a ton of media. You had what appeared to most everyone in some regard, a high stakes election, certainly a historical election, right? You had a lot of money at play and a lot of outreach and a lot of mobilization. And I think all of that brings out voters, period, and it tends to down trickle to, if you will, to those that are less likely to vote. Then the question is how much additional gets to those folks that are less likely, like young. And there was a lot of media around trying to mobilize the youth vote. And some of it got.
Is there something to be said? I mean, so since the presidential election is the Super Bowl of elections, and people could turn out for those and get excited about them, there's all the media, there's all the engagement, there's a sense of relevancy. Is there value in trying to consolidate more elections and have less off-cycle elections so that the young people who are turned out to vote up ticket with the presidential vote on a broader range of issues?
Yeah, so we just saw this issue come up in LA, right? I think some of the research is mixed, but I think one way to look at it is if when you have multiple elections, right, and we think about information, think about voters, period, about that they are information poor. They need information, they need education, they need to be mobilized. When you have elections split over different time periods and voters are not as clear about the fact that there is even an election. Even last November, we heard from a lot of folks that didn't even realize there was necessarily an election. They didn't know there was a governor's race, right? Because that might seem odd to many of us because we saw it on the news, we know it was happening.
It was such an exciting race.
It was such an exciting race, but again, for voters that don't frequently go to the polls, right, they're not tuned into the same networks and have the same conversations as I would imagine many of the folks here, or at least voters that do traditionally go at high rates. So information matters, and I think that's what you're asking in presidential years. Certainly there's more of that. And then if you have consolidation of elections, arguably then you would expect that there would be, again, more information, more discussion, more at stake on a given ballot, and people at least would be aware and maybe see that election as something that has more relevancy for them.
Okay.
I'm answering your question in a roundabout way.
So is the relevancy, does it come from all the media and attention? Is that?
I think in that case, there's two things going on, right? You do actually have a ballot that might has more at play. If you don't care about school boards, there's something else going on, right? So, or whatever it might be. And there also is then more media and more discussion and more outreach, more campaigns that are vying for people, probably more, literally more contact and more phone calls and more materials in the mail and all those sorts of things.
All right. Let's talk about two places. San Francisco, they're talking about.
Jump in here too, please.
I got more questions for others. I'm sorry for.
You can
find this very
counter me
interesting.
at any point.
San Francisco's. Yeah, please do jump in if you have particular thoughts on this stuff. But San Francisco's thinking about lowering the voting age to 16 for local elections.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually been asked a lot about this recently by different press. Okay, so this is the deal on 16-year-old voting. It's uncharted territory, so we don't have any, first off, as a researcher, I have to tell you, we don't have any research directly on 16-year-old voting. There's only one place, well now two cities in the country that have implemented 16-year-old voting, only one that's actually had an election, Tahoma Park, Maryland. In that one small election, 16 and 17-year-olds did vote at higher rates, and so that was very interesting, but otherwise...
Higher rates than everyone else?
Not than everyone else. Oh, gosh, I can't remember the
They certainly would have
comparison.
voted at higher rates than the last time.
Higher rates than...
higher.
No, thank you for asking that. I'll have to double check the age comparisons, but what I understand, it was higher rates than previous youth that were 18 to 24 at least. Yeah, and I think there's a little bit more to that. But so that was interesting, but that was one small election. So other than that, we don't have any data. However, what we do have is a lot of other data on the youth vote that would suggest that 16-year-old voting is an interesting discussion and may have a positive impact to some degree. So what that is this discussion of youth voting being habit forming. So we know
Right.
that if we get to youth before they're 18, this is before they're 18, and we teach them the what and the why and the how hands-on of voting. We talk to them about why it's relevant to their lives, their communities, all the things I mentioned, particularly if peers are involved. If they engage in mock elections, those sorts of things, they are going to be much more likely to both register and vote when they're 18, and then you've got them, right, much more likely to have them for life. And so because we know that all these efforts at making it relevant and tangible impact the likelihood of voting at 18, and mock elections, again, as I mentioned, it stands, again, we don't have direct research, but it stands to reason for many of us in the field that if a mock election helps turn out, then what about potentially a real election? Making it even more hands-on and tangible. However, that being said, I think as with any reform, if this was going to happen, you'd have to have a lot of support for those 16 to 17-year-olds in that process, because you certainly wouldn't want this to be something that would, if they're not educated about the process, that they go and they end up being frustrated and they get turned off from voting, right? If they're not supported by their community, by their registrar, by their teachers, whomever it might be. Or that maybe they don't turn out and people turn to this reform and say, hey, it didn't work, it failed. Youth really don't care. They are apathetic. So there'd have to be one thing to talk about in this larger discussion would be how to support them and make them successful. That being said.
Yeah, good point.
One thought
Please.
on that score. There's actually is an interesting paper recently that looked at the impact of pre-registration, which is something that we do have in California, haven't been implemented yet, but we have and is going to be implemented. The pre-registration, this paper looked not at whether pre-registration, the availability of it made people more likely to register, but whether the act of registering through pre-registration as opposed to registering the traditional way, and they did this by comparing people who were sort of just a little bit too young to register the traditional way, and so they missed out and they registered through pre-registration instead. And compared to that, to the people who were just old enough to be able to do it the traditional way, the pre-registrants actually turned out to vote at higher rates, and they did so several years down the road at the next presidential election. And the argument here was that the pre-registrants were far more likely to have done so through some kind of mobilization event program at their school, something with some hoopla, right? And that would sort of engage them in the process in a way that that just registering the traditional way would not. And young people are very impressionable, and so they, if you can get them at that point, that's the very moment, 16, 17, 18, up to early 20s, when people shape their political identities. We have mountains of evidence on this, right? So this, that's the time to reach them, to try and convince them that it's a good idea to participate and to be sure to show up. So I could imagine, for instance, if you didn't want, I was just ruminating on this while Mindy was talking, but I could imagine if you didn't want the votes of these people to count, 16, 17-year-olds, you could still have sort of an election for them that registered their preferences and was where the results were broadcast widely, and make sure that it was actually an official event where you were reaching into schools and having it be a sort of a kind of an exciting thing. And you could also, as a part of that, have pre-registration for voting in state elections, and that all of that might engage these young people in a way that would have lasting impacts down the road. Mm-hmm. But again, this is relatively uncharted territory here, so it's kind of speculation.
Oh, that's interesting. Let me jump over to Wendy. I mean, I've been very intrigued by the Colorado model for some time, the Oregon model too, actually. But do you think it would work well in California? I mean, we're so much bigger. Our one county alone is larger than 40 U.S. states. Love to hear your thoughts on its applicability to California, given what you understand about our system.
What I can offer is that some of these other reforms kind of come first. The clean voter registration rolls maybe is a precursor for it. Maybe experiencing vote centers is a precursor for it. Maybe experiencing more with electronic poll books. Those are all things Colorado had in place, and I don't believe are in place here at that same level. So I guess that's a cautionary tale to not jump in with all of those things at once. Take it step by step.
Okay. Do you know if there's other states talking about adopting the Colorado model?
Not at the level that you all are. When I've been at National Association meetings, they all do want to say, hey, how's that thing working in Colorado?
Okay. Let me ask the same questions about Oregon. How much is this new change, causing ripples across the nation? How much are other states talking about this model? And maybe Eric wants to jump in on that as well. And then do you think, obviously Eric thinks so, but do you think California's a good candidate for automatic voter reg?
There are about a dozen, maybe it's 8 or 10 other states that did have legislation this year to create automatic registration, and Hawaii was one of them with several bills to do it. I'm not going to make any guesses as to whether any of the others are going to go forward this year. Oftentimes it takes a while to, as you all know. So yes, there is interest elsewhere, and yes, there was this little pop of excitement in the election world when Oregon did this, because it is seen as a major shift. Your second question was about whether California is in a good position to do this. And I do not know the answer to the question I'm going to propose. It's for you all to discuss with your election people. But I don't know if your data from the DMV is such that it can link up nicely with your data for voter registration. And if not, there's a place to look there. What's coming out of one has to go into the other.
Right.
And right now, you've got the forms going. Possibly on paper, I don't know if you do an electronic transmission at this point, but that would be a key question as to whether you could go that direction.
I mean, so Oregon just had a DMV that was really on the ball and had good lists and good databases, that sort of thing, relatively speaking?
Yeah, I'm going to say that. I hope I'm right about that. Does anyone else know whether Oregon is?
I mean, I think they were linked in that sense. I mean, obviously, this is something that would have to wait for VoCal to be up and running, right? I mean, it's with most of these reforms, we're waiting on VoCal, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you, what's your sense, what was the main opposition to it in Oregon, and how was it overcome? Parties upset about it? That sort of thing. I'd love to get a sense of the politics of the passage.
I can't tell you so much about the politics at this point. I'd be happy to look into that a little bit further for you. But I can say that, generally speaking, people tend to be cautious or even conservative about making major changes to election law because it is so core to the way a legislature functions or any part of the political process functions. So there could have been some folks on the nay side just saying, we're not ready to do that. Let's not jump.
Okay.
What I had understood, and again, I wasn't there when the debate was going on, but there were concerns about privacy, that these records were suddenly being transmitted around, and that there were concerns that maybe they might get into the wrong hands, something along those lines. And then Oregon actually considered this reform a couple of years ago, and it failed by one vote. And the one vote, the quote that I read at that time was she felt like if people didn't take the trouble to register, then that was their problem.
What
So.
about the political parties? I mean, where do they weigh in on this? Do you know?
In California?
No, in Oregon.
Oh, that I don't know.
I can say that the legislature has been held by Democrats for the last several years as they've considered it previously.
I guess I'm just asking, were the party people worried because this could help to exacerbate the decline to state trend, or because a lot of people aren't going to opt into one of the parties. You don't know? Okay. Okay. Others.